From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. I urge you, at this moment of national emergency, to stay at home, protect our NHS, and save lives.
The lies that were coming out from the very top are totally unforgivable.
I've been told by a source that there is another, more confidential VIP lane and 16 contracts that the government haven't released information on because they're deemed commercially sensitive.
Now, for the first time in 2 years, Baroness Mone breaks her silence to respond to the criminal allegations she faces. And my investigation reveals an allegation a government official saying he can make a civil and criminal case go away for a sum of money.
It was purely just whether there's a bigger pot, if you like, that is there to satisfy both elements.
In January 2020, all of our lives changed forever.
I'm speaking to you at what I know is an increasingly challenging time. A time of disruption in the life of our country. A disruption that has brought grief to some, financial difficulties to many, and enormous changes to the daily lives of us all.
The first case of COVID-19 was declared in England.
A virus spreading, planes grounded, trade stalling, and even sporting events cancelled.
Coronavirus has reached the UK. 2 patients from the same family in England tested positive on Friday. They are the first such cases in Britain.
The government took unprecedented steps to warn the public.
The number of COVID patients is definitely going up. It's heartbreaking.
When you have to tell somebody that you think this is the start of their lungs failing and that they're not going to get better, that is really, really heartbreaking.
Over the following months, the UK government mobilised a wide-ranging response. Huge restrictions on the public, a vaccine and a drive to secure PPE for hospital staff. I'm Mark Williams-Thomas, a former British detective turned journalist with over 30 years' experience investigating some of the biggest cases in the UK and worldwide, like my world-exclusive interview with Paralympian Oscar Pistorius.
They try and say that I broke down a door with a cricket bat. I can't even hold a cricket bat up if I don't have my arms to balance.
Now, in my latest investigation, I have turned my attention on the government's response to the COVID pandemic, and in particular, the role of MPs and peers, and in a difficult investigation, gained exclusive access to Baroness Mone.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do this.
We can.
No, thank you.
Baroness Mone has become the poster girl for the PPE scandal as a result of her referring her husband, Doug Barrowman's consortium, PPE MedPro, to the government. She is now under a criminal investigation. But before I carefully examine her case and put to her the allegations she faces, I want to consider a number of the other MPs and peers who were involved in referring friends or associates to a designated high-priority VIP lane. I have identified 10 Conservative MPs and peers who referred companies to a VIP lane, which then won PPE contracts to a value of £1.6 billion.
One of the questions I want to answer is, did any MP or peer benefit as a result of very large contracts being awarded to companies they referred to the government's high-priority or VIP lane? Was there any corruption or wrongdoing in the awarding of those contracts?
Our demand is clear. End the cover-up and begin the clean-up. Yeah. We already know that the so-called VIP lane for PPE enabled the shameful waste of taxpayers' money and inexcusable profiteering by unfit and unqualified providers.
At the start of the pandemic, the government had run out of PPE supplies, so a call to action went out and they were inundated with responses. Some 14,000 new offers to supply PPE equipment, so the Department of Health and Social Care, more commonly known as the DHSC, whose responsibility it was to source PPE for the NHS and other public bodies, created 2 lanes so as to triage the 14,000 new offers. One was a general lane for members of the public, the other became known as a VIP, high priority lane created to allow referrals from MPs, ministers and senior officials. There was also a third lane for previously approved PPE suppliers.
The VIP lane, there were some 493 suppliers that were referred to you through that, of which 51 suppliers were awarded 115 contracts. What were the main reasons for awarding contracts to those suppliers rather than any of the others?
The reasons for awarding contracts were the same. What we call a high priority lane, or indeed that came for the general open source procurement, that we were looking for whether the supplier had credible provision of PPE. So, did they have the right stuff? Did it meet the technical requirements? Could they deliver decent volumes? So, a provider offering a few million would not be prioritised against a provider offering hundreds of millions, and their price.
So DHSC officials told Parliament the checks were the same through both the new lanes. But were the outcomes the same? The National Audit Office found that firms referred through the VIP high priority lane had a 10 times greater success rate for securing contracts than companies whose bids were processed through the other channels. So what were the details? 394 contracts awarded to both the new lanes. In the VIP high priority lane, 115 contracts to 51 suppliers to a value of 3.8 billion, and in the other new non-VIP lane, 279 contracts awarded to 100 suppliers to a value of 4.1 billion. Of the 2 new lanes, the high priority lane contributed 29% of the entire PPE purchased in the period, and data from July 2022 shows 176 contracts from the 2 new lanes to a value of 2.7 billion are disputed, and shockingly, £400 million of PPE fraud, with items paid for never delivered. But have the government been totally transparent? In 2020, the government informed the National Audit Office there were 47 companies in the VIP lane. Almost a year later, the list went to 50, then 51, but my source believes it to be much higher.
I've been told by a source that there is another, more confidential VIP lane and 16 contracts that the government haven't released information on because they're deemed commercially sensitive. As I investigate the government's handling of the PPE crisis, there is a lot more still to come out.
Dr. David Oliver is a hospital consultant and former president of the Royal College of Physicians, and writes regularly for the British Medical Journal and worked on the front line during the pandemic.
David, talk me through the first few days when COVID hit.
We were aware in the NHS in January and February that COVID was happening in Wuhan, and then it had come to Europe. By early March, we had the first person to die from COVID. It was actually in my own hospital. None of us really knew how bad things were going to get, whether we too would be overwhelmed as other countries had been. We didn't have adequate personal protective equipment. I think there was confusion from government agencies at the start about how we were going to respond to the pandemic. Obviously, there's a global PPE shortage, and some countries have prepared and stockpiled better. And because there were PPE shortages, it had to be rationed. I personally knew 5 doctors who were friends of mine who died, and and most
from
of
the PPE.
Well, you can't. It'd be very hard to say whether a lack of PPE caused their death, but the point is they died from catching COVID in the course of their work.
Billions and billions of PPE sits in containers in fields now. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's corrupt. The National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee and 1 or 2 court rulings as well in the appellant courts have made this point, that the NAO was strongly critical, saying the government was dishing out contracts to private suppliers, some of them unqualified for the role.
We have selected 10 Conservative MPs and peers who have referred companies to the PPE high priority VIP lane to a value of £1.6 billion. No other political party successfully referred companies through this fast-track route. So who were the Conservative MPs and peers who referred companies to the VIP lane? We start with Lord Agnew, Cabinet Office Minister, who referred 3 companies, including WorldLink Resources, who landed a £258 million contract, and Uniserve, who are owned by Ian Liddell. They describe themselves as providers of logistics and global trade management.
Uniserve won a contract to supply gowns, goggles, masks and visors, all to a value of £303 million, exclusively to Uniserve, without any other company having the opportunity to bid for them.
Uniserve's offices are at Upminster Court in Essex, the same location of the constituency office of Julia Lopez MP, who at the time of the pandemic was Parliamentary Secretary at the Cabinet Office, and she could be seen here with Uniserve owner Ian Liddell. Uniserve deny that they ever spoke to Miss Lopez about any PPE contracts. Then we have Lord Feldman, appointed at the start of the pandemic to advise the DHSC on procuring PPE. He referred 3 companies, one of which was SG Recruitment, which landed £50 million worth of PPE contracts. Lord Feldman had SG Recruitment and its CEO David Sumner referred to him by Lord Chadlington.
I, Peter, Lord Chadlington, do swear by Almighty God that I'll be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to law, so help me God.
And Lord Chadlington was a director and shareholder of Sumner Group Holdings, the parent company of SG Recruitment. They won 2 contracts worth £23.9 million and £26.1 million. Lord Chadlington notified the House of Lords Register of Interests some 24 months after SG Recruitment won the PPE contracts that his interest in Sumner Group Holdings ceased in 2021, a year after SG Recruitment won the PPE contracts. So, as a director of the parent company, when they won PPE contracts, did Lord Chadlington indirectly benefit from SG Recruitment winning 2 lucrative PPE contracts? Then we have Matt Hancock, who at the time of the pandemic was the Health Secretary, whose honesty has been called into question by Helen McNamara, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary during COVID.
But does it come back to the fact that Mr. Hancock regularly was telling people things that they later discovered weren't true?
Yes.
Hancock referred 4 firms, including Excalibur Healthcare, who won contracts worth £135.4 million, 9 United, who won contracts to a value of £80.7 million, and Monarch Acoustics, who won contracts worth £18.8 million. An investigation by the Good Law Project found that Hancock was contacted by Genix Healthcare owner Mustafa Mohammed. Mohammed is a leading Conservative Party donor, having given almost $400,000 to the party. Mohammed, when he contacted Hancock, was working in partnership with Ecolog International to provide COVID testing services. Mr. Mohammed proceeded to have a series of WhatsApp messages with Hancock about Ecolog. Hancock referred Ecolog to the high priority VIP lane. As a result, the government entered into an agreement with Ecolog with a letter of intent for them to provide laboratory equipment and PCR testing, but this was never acted upon. So in 2021, the government paid Ecolog £38.6 million, they say, for breaking the contractual agreement they had with them to provide laboratory equipment and PCR testing. Incredible. £38.6 million of public money wasted. Yet who has been held responsible for this?
The impact of coronavirus has been deeply felt, and yet thanks to the extraordinary action that this country has taken, it is now in decline at a national level.
There is no suggestion that Hancock did anything wrong or benefited from the referrals he made, but I do question how appropriate it was to allow the Health Secretary, who was very much at the forefront of the government's COVID response, to have been able to make any referrals. Next up, well-known MP Michael Gove and his Conservative Party donor friend David Mellor CBE, owner of Mellor Designs. Mellor backed Gove's failed leadership battle attempt in 2016 and at the time was his campaign chair of finance. Mellor Designs via the VIP lane was awarded 6 PPE contracts worth $164 million. The disclosure by the government states that the Duchy of Lancaster made the referral. At the time the contracts were awarded, Gove was head of the Cabinet Office, responsible for government procurement and in charge of the office of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. To show further how connected David Mellor was, on the 6th of April 2020 he called Lord Bethell, Health Minister who oversaw the awarding of PPE contracts, and said that he was disappointed with the speed at which his £65 million contract for face masks was being awarded. Lord Bethell recommended that the delays should be dealt with urgently. Also on the same call was Lord Bethell's unpaid advisor Lord Feldman, who we have already heard about in relation to SG recruitment. Mellor Designs made more than £13 million profit after tax in 2020 as a result of the PPE pandemic. The year before, it made just $144,000. Gove has refused to release the communications he had with Mellor during the pandemic. Conservative backbench MPs Julian Lewis, Andrew Percy, Steve Brine and Esther McVeigh, and the Conservative peers Lord Dayton and Baroness Mone all referred one supplier each. We have no evidence that any of the MPs or peers named benefited from their referring companies to the high priority VIP lane.
The question now remains, how many other referrals have there been to the high priority VIP lane that we do not yet know about? Have any of those committed breaches of code of conduct or even criminal offences? The truth is, we're unlikely to ever know unless there's a civil servant or government leak, because the government is just not being open and transparent in relation to the information that they hold. They're not releasing it. I firmly believe if everything was known, there would be other MPs, ministers and House of Lords representatives who would be under investigation.
I wanted to understand more from David what responsibility NHS trusts and the government took about the lack of PPE for frontline staff.
I wrote to 130 NHS trusts and I asked them 3 questions, which was, have you had to restrict and ration PPE use? Have you disciplined or warned people for complaining about it? And have you disciplined or warned people for going on social media or in the media to complain about it? Only one trust admitted it had disciplined anybody, and yet we know from the Doctors Association that they logged at least 1,500 instances of people not getting adequate PPE and another 200 plus instances of people being warned, silenced.
At the time of the national crisis, I accept that some level of control is required regarding the public message, but David tells me about how staff were silenced and stopped from speaking out.
I know a lot of comms directors around the NHS, experienced, often former journalists, communications professionals. They were being told from the centre, NHS England, Cabinet Office comms, to keep quiet. They were having everything they said vetted. The General Medical Council guidance makes it clear that we must raise concerns about safety and risk when we see them, and that senior doctors in management roles, and the same applies to nurses, must listen and must create a conducive environment.
In April 2020, the UK government almost ran out of PPE supply and so planned to build up 4 months' worth of stock across the 7 categories of PPE. But instead of building up 4 months' supply, it ordered 5 years' worth. 37.9 billion items of PPE at a cost of 13.1 billion. And due to competing demands around the world, suppliers of PPE increased their prices to an average of 5 times more. So the 13.1 billion spent by government in 2020, 12 months earlier, would have cost them just 2.62 billion. MP Dawn Butler does not hold back in her criticism of the government's handling of PPE.
Because what has happened is really shocking. The cronyism and the corruption that has happened in the government in plain sight is truly, truly shocking. And now the government is spending £10 million burning PPE. I mean, it's like you're burning the evidence. You wonder why.
So why have the government taken to destroying and burning PPE? Because with the exception of goggles, non-sterile gowns and face masks, the rest of PPE has a shelf life. The National Audit Office found that 51% of excess stock had an expiry date of less than 6 months, with a maximum shelf life being 2 years. So most of the PPE bought by the government is long out of date and can't be used. And you can see from this footage from June 2023, large amounts of unused PPE gowns at a nature reserve near Southampton are waiting to be destroyed. What a shocking waste of public money. MP Angela Rayner spoke about the PPE wastage in Parliament.
Ministers have admitted that they are still paying £770,000 a day of taxpayers' cash to store gloves, goggles and gowns, enough to pay for 75,000 spaces in after-school clubs. £106,000 of that money is sent to China every day alone to pay for the storage costs.
It's clear that the government's handling of the PPE procurement was shambolic, and I, like others, question the awarding of some of those contracts. We know of at least 10 Conservative MPs and peers who referred companies to the government's high priority VIP lane to a value of at least £1.6 billion. But there is one referrer that's attracted more headlines than any other case, that of PPE MedPro, referred by Baroness Mone.
Now, Mr. Speaker, how did his colleague, Baroness Mone, end up with nearly £30 million of taxpayers' money in her bank account?
Mr. Speaker, let me say, like everyone else, I was absolutely shocked to read about the allegation. It's absolutely right. It's absolutely right that she is no longer attending the House of Lords and therefore no longer has the Conservative whip. There's a process in place. It's right that that process concludes. I hope that it's resolved promptly.
In December 2022, Baroness Mone responded to the allegations levelled against her, saying that she was taking an immediate leave of absence from the House of Lords in order to clear her name for allegations that she says are unjustly levelled against her. So questions about Baroness Mone's involvement in PPE have reached the highest level in government and drawn huge public attention. One of my key skills is getting access to people who are in the media spotlight. And now, after months of conversations and a number of meetings, Baroness Mone and her husband Doug Barrowman have agreed to give me complete access to both the civil and criminal case files, so that I could make up my own mind about both cases. For 2 years, they've remained silent, but now they want their PPE story told. So Baroness Mone and Doug Barrowman have agreed to give me an interview and formally respond to all the allegations against them. I'm on my way to their home on the Isle of Man to spend some time with them. But what is the background to this case?
At the height of the pandemic, they provided PPE to the government, but they now find themselves subject to a criminal investigation and a civil claim. They maintain they are innocent, but for over 2 years they've remained silent, but now they want to have their say. They want to respond in detail to the allegations they face.
Hi, Doug.
Hello, Mark. Nice to see you again.
And you, Michelle. Nice to meet you.
Nice
All right.
to see you as well. Hi.
Come in.
Yeah, of course.
Come in.
Before I start my investigation and review of their case, I've explained to them both that I have very clear rules, that if I find any evidence as part of my investigation that shows they have committed a criminal offence, I will reveal it. I want to properly understand why Baroness Mone has remained silent.
I don't know if I can do this.
You can.
No, thank you.
All right. What can I do to help?
Nothing.
Do you want 5 minutes?
Michelle says she's not up to giving an interview. We've agreed we will try again tomorrow. So I'm going to ask Doug how he and Michelle got involved with helping to supply PPE.
So Michelle and I obviously were in lockdown. We're continually watching the TV screens, the fact that there's no PPE supplies, and it was clearly a problem. Michelle and I looked at each other one day and said, you know, we have strong contacts here in the Far East. Essentially, Michelle reached out to her contacts. We formed a consortium venture with a company based in Hong Kong and a company based in the UK, pulled together so we could effectively deal direct as a consortium.
You didn't get a deposit. It meant that you had to put the money up. Why would you do that?
Well, we knew with our contact base that we could actually supply the volume, and we believed we could get competitive prices. So Michelle reached out to Michael Gove, who then referred on to Lord Agnew, who was coordinating referrals. A discussion took place with the Cabinet Office, who put PP MedPro through the ringer in terms of we were a start-up venture. We had made that clear to them. There was no shortcuts. In fact, I think they gave us a very hard time because they were worried about the fact we were a start-up business. For example, they gave us no upfront deposits. The risk was significant. I mean, for example, to even enter into discussions with the Cabinet Office, we put up 5 million into a bank account just to say we'll hold that money there until the end of the first contract, the mass contract, which we did do.
So Doug forms a consortium, and as PPE MedPro, they bid for government contracts, having been introduced by Baroness Mone. After the call to action, the recommending of companies had become the norm at the time for many ministers, MPs and House of Lords representatives. PPE MedPro were awarded 2 contracts.
First contract, 210 million Type IIR masks. That went ahead, not a problem. The masks were used, were deployed. The second contract was for 25 million gowns. We had delivered the 25 million gowns by the end of August. And by then it was clear that they had way too much. They then brought in external consultants to pore over the contracts, and they were looking for technicalities in the contract to try and get out of paying. And the irony is, PP MedPro was only under obligation to produce the goods and deliver them ex-works, i.e. our responsibility ended at the factory. So essentially, UNICEF, the government's agent, had been collecting for months our gowns, looking at the packaging, looking at the sterility records, the batch sterilisation records, looking at everything that it was compliant to ensure that the product was good. And the product was delivered. We were paid for the product, which was a condition of the contract, that only when they were happy with the goods.
So 210 million masks ordered in May 2020 were delivered, checked and paid for with no issues. And the order for 25 million gowns in June 2020 were also delivered, checked and paid for with no issues. It was UNICEF who handled the transportation of PPE MedPro's gowns and masks, and then, almost 2 years after the gowns were delivered, PPE MedPro were advised that there were issues with the gowns. There has been much media coverage that PPE MedPro overcharged, but do the facts reflect this? During April through May 2020, the average price paid for a Type IIR mask was 51p, UNICEF 87p, Purple Surgical Limited 78p, Ayanda Capital 65p. Their masks were found to be defective and were never used. There was no claim against Ayanda due to contractual technicalities. And PP MedPro's price 38.5p. So MedPro's masks were 12.5p cheaper than average. And per sterile gown marched through to April 2020, where the average price was £7 to £12, Sega £6.60, one supplier to the Royal Free Hospital £12, and PPE MedPro £4.88. Doug has a further comment to make on the value that he says PPE MedPro offered compared to other suppliers.
The British government had been paying between £7 and £12 a gown over the period in which we were supplying. So when we actually look at our gowns, we were on average £3 a gown under what the government had been paying. So we saved them 75 million there. If you look at the average on the mass of 51p versus our 38.5p, We saved them 25 million there. So our prices saved the government over £100 million.
In December 2022, the DHSC commenced a civil claim against PPE MedPro. One of the issues they are focused on is that PPE MedPro incorrectly produced single-wrapped gowns, and the media coverage has certainly singled them out as being sole providers of single-wrapped gowns with an issue. But is this correct? I have looked at 25 other gown contracts at the time and can reveal that all of them supplied single-wrapped gowns. So what happened? In September 2020, the DHSC started to contact PPE suppliers, asking them to now provide the gowns double-wrapped, even though all the contracts had been for single-wrapped gowns. The NHS's preferred specification at the time was for gowns to be double-wrapped. The DHSC realised it had a problem with its own contract specification. So hundreds of millions of gowns were rejected because the NHS's preference is towards double-wrapped gowns. The government's PPE procurement team failed to specify this in their contracts. The next claim from the DHSC against PPE MedPro is that the gowns did not have a specific certification.
What they then do is they then try and make out that we hadn't produced the gowns to specification using a derogation for what has became known as an equivalent technical solution. Under a pandemic, you're allowed to use alternative processes. The equivalent technical solution we produced was fully compliant. Our gown manufacturer produced a non-sterile gown. They had a CE marking. What the DHSC subsequently said was, well, your gowns didn't have a joined-up CE marking, i.e. one CE marking that covered both the gown and the sterilisation process, as opposed to we've got two individual CE markings that still give us the same joined-up product. And the irony is that the suppliers that did have a joined-up CE marking for both gowns and sterilisation themselves used exactly the same sterilisation plants to outsource their non-sterile gowns.
So Doug denies the DHSC's claim that PPE MedPro did not have an approved certification, because what he says is that the gown's manufacturer had an approved certification and the sterilisation process had an approved certification, so two certifications covering the whole process. But the DHSC's argument is there has to be one certification for the whole process.
And the final and perhaps main issue is one of sterilisation. On the 24th of February 2022, almost 2 years after the DHSC received PPE MedPro gowns, they sent 60 of the 25 million gowns off for sterilisation testing. The DHSC says that 60 is a representative sample of 25 million.
But is it? Our investigation shows that the 60 gowns sent for sterilisation testing by the government were most likely taken from just 2 of the total 524 gown containers supplied by PPE MedPro, so a percentage sampling of between 0.4% and 0.6%. In addition to this, we have established that PPE MedPro gowns went to 7 different DHSC approved factories for sterilisation. Yet the tested gowns were taken from a container holding gowns from just 1 of the 7 sterilisation factories. So 60 gowns from 25 million and taken from just 1 of the 7 sterilisation factories. This really does cast doubt on the representative sample argument. And furthermore, astonishingly, the 60 tested gowns are government's evidence to support their argument that PPE MedPro gowns were not sterile has serious problems. The samples were unaccounted for 3 weeks after leaving the storage facility and arriving at the testing location. And the 60 tested gowns, their evidence, they have now destroyed. I can now exclusively reveal that it was not just PPE MedPro gowns that were sent for sterilisation testing, but samples from 25 other suppliers of single-bagged gowns were also sent off. The government has refused to tell us the results of these tests, so how important were they? Well, in September 2021, Spotlight on Corruption magazine revealed that the DHSC had deemed 25 suppliers of PPE from the VIP lane as not fit for purpose. So when the gowns made by PPE MedPro and other companies, including those referred by Michael Gove and Matt Hancock, were sent for testing, the DHSC had already deemed at least 25 companies, including PPE MedPro, who all provided single-bagged gowns, as not fit for purpose, because the DHSC failed to specify double-wrapped gowns in all their contracts at the time. There is another major issue with the gown sterilisation, and this is linked to storage. The DHSC accepts that storage of PPE in containers does degrade them, as seen by this extract from their 2021 annual report, in which it states, whilst the department continues to hold inventory in shipping containers, there is a risk that the PPE degrades more quickly than if it was stored in a proper warehouse. Shipping containers can get very hot and very cold, with temperatures ranging from as high as 57 degrees Celsius to as low as minus 29 degrees Celsius. So how long were PPE MedPro's tested gowns stored in containers for? Well, between 131 and 461 days, so a considerable period of time. PPE MedPro was ex-works, which means that their responsibility ended when DHSC shipping agents in China took responsibility for them. The DHSC's claim is that the sterilisation process failed before they took delivery and ownership of the gowns from PPE MedPro. Yet, I've seen documents and pictures that show that when the boxes containing gowns left the irradiation factories, from where they went to the DHSC shipping agent, the gowns had passed the sterilisation process. This is evidenced by the dot turning red on the indicator labels, showing that the gowns had received the correct irradiation dosage. This element of the claim is, however, I believe problematic for the DHSC for two reasons. Firstly, that the government signed off all the factories' irradiation processes 2 weeks before the gowns order was confirmed, as seen here in this email exchange. And secondly, that they are saying sterilisation failed at all 7 of the irradiation factories. These factories are owned by multinational companies making PPE for governments around the world, and yet there are no reports of other sterility failings. Therefore, everything points to sterility failing after the DHSC logistic company took control of PPE MedPro's gowns in China. In the civil case, the DHSC entered into mediation with PPE MedPro, and this revealed 3 worrying conversations.
So the first proper meaningful mediation that was had was in September 2021, where PPE MedPro's team met with the DHSC and the legal people with a view to trying to mediate a position, albeit our position was we did nothing wrong. And it was very clear the threatening manner of the DHSC negotiators at that time was, if you don't come to a settlement and give us all the information that we want, then this is going to become very unpleasant for the principals behind PPE MedPro, i.e. the owners of PPE MedPro, which implied myself and possibly our consortium partners. And what's really clear after the event, because we see the documentation, is that the NCA had started their investigation in May of 21, a few months earlier than that first mediation. And it was very, very clear the two of them were talking to each other, because that open threat wasn't even a veiled threat.
Well, it is a threat, isn't it?
Very threatening language, yes. Do you know what's in store for your principals, i.e. your owners of MedPro? Very, very inappropriate language to use at a mediation where you're supposed to be agreeing differences. They immediately resort to threat and bully boy tactics. And part of the problem they had is they created so much publicity through leaking, and they admitted that there was leaks within DHSC.
So just to be clear on that, so the DHSC said to you that they accept there's leaks from within the DHSC to the media?
And that they could not guarantee that any deal that we did would not end up in the media.
This is a recording of what the DHSC representatives said during that meeting with Doug.
We're just flagging, Doug, that effectively, as we've said a number of times, the department, I'm afraid, does have leaks, so it's one of those.
What Doug told me next was a very serious allegation against the DHSC that came out during mediation. The NCA stands for the National Crime Agency, a law enforcement body that is responsible for the criminal investigation into Baroness Mone and Doug Barrowman.
The bombshell comes from the other side, the DHSC negotiators, who I'm keeping the individual's name out of it for now. And that is, on the sum of money I offered, which was my final offer, this particular individual from the negotiation team turned around to me and said, "So tell me, Doug, would you pay more for the other matter to go away?" And the only other matter on the table was, of course, the NCA investigation. Now, I was gobsmacked. I was absolutely gobsmacked.
Government official saying to you, give us a sum of money and we can make the criminal case go away.
I was shocked. I spoke to my legal people afterwards, and they said that was illegal. Go back on and have another call with these people because it is in the public interest. And this time, tape the call.
Obviously, we understand you've made an offer, and it's a sizable sum of money. We're just trying to piece together and thinking through, and I think our view at the moment and where we stand, it is probably not likely to be enough to call the dogs off. So I just had it in my mind, and the reason I asked it, because I can completely understand, and what effectively happens if on the NCA side, and I know you're going to obviously fight that very hard, and you don't agree with it, but I was just trying to work through in my mind, thinking, is Doug sort of thinking here that that he has to hold a bit of what he might be willing to pay back because he's unsure of what's happening over there.
My belief is that somewhere up the food chain the two matters are joined, both the civil and the criminal matter, and I believe that you felt maybe the criminal matter was an extra leverage on me excuse me, to make a settlement on the civil, and this was raised for the first time by you yesterday, and I was just intrigued, and I thought about it, and I was just keen to find out more, really, that was all, because that could be very relevant, very relevant.
Yeah, no, I mean, and obviously there's, unfortunately, from our perspective, we said a number of times, we don't have any visibility, we don't have any meaningful contacts there, so there's nothing we can reasonably do. It was purely just whether there's a bigger pot, if you like, that is there to satisfy both elements.
Doug says he offered a sum of money to settle the dispute, not because he admits any wrongdoing, but he knew to defend it was going to cost him millions and take up a lot of his time. So the DHSC representative does accept that he was exploring if a pot of money exists that could satisfy both elements. I think this very clearly means a sum of money that would make both the civil and criminal case go away. Although in contradiction, he does also state that in this case he has no meaningful contact with the criminal investigation aspect. I find this statement and position from a government official very serious and potentially criminal. I've spoken to Michelle overnight, and she has said she wants to try again and give an interview.
Alright, when you're ready.
Michelle has become very emotional and asked us to stop filming. Michelle is not in a good place mentally, but she says she wants to give an interview and answer her critics. I've suggested we go to Glasgow in Scotland, where Michelle grew up and where she feels very much at home, which will hopefully help her feel more relaxed. I've made it very clear to her that this is the last chance she has to have her side heard. So what of the media coverage about her? Has it been fair?
So since I've been doing this investigation, almost daily I have seen articles written, comment made in social media about Michelle Mone profiting from the PPE scandal. And actually overnight there was an article that was published. Just tell me what that article is.
So this is an article by a publication called The New European, and what it says is, stop this boat. And we got the usual glamour shot of my wife with the boat, which is named the Lady M. And what they say with the headline is, Tory peer Michelle Mone bought herself a yacht with profits from useless NHS protective gear. And it goes on to say the government should do something about it. Well, the fact of the matter is that yacht was not bought with anything to do with PPE profits or money. It was bought from within my family office from other non-related sources. I named after my wife, Lady M, which they then interpret as, oh, it must be Michelle Mone's yacht. So we've got a situation where the yacht was bought with nothing to do with PPE MedPro money. The yacht is not owned by Michelle. And the other thing they talk about is from useless NHS protective gear. What they don't say is 210 million Type IIR masks were delivered on time to spec and at competitive price and used. And what they don't say is the gowns are the subject of an ongoing commercial dispute where we believe we will win because we believe we supplied the goods on time and to specification.
I caught up with Doug the next day to ask an important question.
Given the pressure that you and Michelle have been under and criticised and the impact it's had on your work, if you went back to the pandemic crisis, would you have got involved again?
Good question. Clearly, the way it's turned out, the answer to that would be no. We can hold our head up high and we delivered our end of the bargain. But with what's happened subsequent to those contracts, then clearly we wouldn't have got involved knowing what I now know. We didn't need to get involved. It wasn't a question of we needed the money as the primary motivation. We wanted to help and do our bit.
Having explored the civil case against PPE MedPro, I now wanted to understand the criminal case against Baroness Mone and Doug Barrowman. I've worked on a number of cases where people have been accused of a serious crime. My last case was a set of parents accused of murdering their son. The police got it completely wrong, and it was only my involvement that managed to get the case finally dropped. In April 2022, the National Crime Agency searched the homes and offices of Doug Barrowman and Baroness Mone in London and on the Isle of Man and seized computers and documents. The NCA investigation into them both is in relation to allegations of conspiracy to defraud, fraud by false representation and bribery, which they both categorically deny. It is, however, Baroness Mone, because of her public profile, who has received the heaviest criticism in the media and received over 450 threats. Baroness Mone in particular has also come under huge criticism from Carol Vorderman. Vorderman has posted over 70 tweets about Mone, which Mone says have been deeply personal and caused her to receive threats. But it's not just Mone that Vorderman has targeted. She was forced to apologise and delete 22 tweets after accusing Conservative Party chair Greg Hands of being involved in the awarding of a £25 million PPE contract. And now Vorderman has been sacked from her BBC Wales radio station for the very issues raised in this programme. The BBC is a publicly funded broadcaster, and as such, it has to remain impartial. So far, the National Crime Agency, as part of their investigation which began in May 2021, so over 30 months ago, have interviewed Baroness Mone and Doug Barrowman only once. So why are they under a criminal investigation?
There is a number of strands of the NCA case, and I've looked at all of them, and one of those strands is that there is a belief that you didn't have a consortium, you were literally layered. Is that true?
That's completely untrue. At the end of the day, we operated as a consortium. We had day-to-day working relationships with each other over and above any normal supply chain situation. We pooled our working capital. We all put the monies up that we had to fulfil the contracts. Profits were held back at the end until we could afford to pay them out. These contracts just needed cash flowing. They had expertise in their fields, such as logistics and supply and manufacture, and we had expertise in administration and contract management as well. So we worked together as a consortium, and that's a fact.
And very clearly set out.
Yes, and we disclosed that at the outset to the British government.
One of the allegations of the NCA case is false representation, but did they misrepresent themselves?
The DHSC themselves, the Cabinet Office, I think were nervous of the fact that Michelle and I were a couple. They probably internally perceived a conflict, which is why they asked us to make written disclosures about her involvement so that they had a piece of paper on file that we were happy to provide because we had nothing to hide. And the situation is unique. If they perceived such a conflict, they should never have awarded the contracts to PP MedPro. They should have said, no thank you, we'll pass on it.
The NCA say that Michelle wasn't involved as much as you say she was.
That's why we're absolutely baffled that this is an argument that is employed by them, because fundamentally it's absurd when you see the volume of communication that goes on to say that she was anything other than involved. And that's always been accepted by us. So to turn that on us is ridiculous.
The government were clearly concerned about a potential conflict of interests, with Baroness Mone recommending her soon-to-be husband's consortium company. Yet they must have satisfied themselves that no conflict existed, given they awarded PPE MedPro contracts. And from the vast amounts of communication I have seen, over 1,400 separate elements, I believe it's inconceivable to say that the government did not know about Baroness Mone's involvement.
I've spent time with Doug and Michelle, and they're very different people. Doug is a firm and tough businessman. He knows the key to success is having the right people working for him, and as such, he's not a hands-on day-to-day person. Work hard, respect him, and the rewards are great, but lie to him or cross him at your peril. Whereas Michelle lives in the moment. There's an immediacy in everything she does. It has to be done now. She's totally driven. She's a very, very good and astute businesswoman. But at this present moment in time, she's in a bad way. There is no doubt that she's suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. She can't focus on anything. She's totally distracted. You can't even get her to read something and retain it. There's no doubt she has dyslexia, but I'm sure there is some neurodivergent condition as well.
I know the public want to hear from Baroness Mone, who's remained silent for the last 2 years and surrounded herself with her loved ones and her 3 dogs. But has remaining silent helped?
I totally understand why lawyers advise those under investigation not to speak. Barristers ply their trade in court, but it's a dangerous strategy because it allows only one side to be heard, and as a result, that narrative becomes fact.
Over the last few days, Michelle has said she feels much stronger, and so we've agreed to head up to Glasgow to give her a final chance to be interviewed. But before we sit down, I want to take her back to the area where she grew up.
So Michelle, you haven't been here for a very long time. I guess this brings back some quite strong emotional memories.
I had such an amazing childhood. I just loved the people in the East End. You know, I'm an East End girl and 25. I lived here since I was born. Kind of started working when I was 10 years old.
What was your job age 10? What did you do?
Paper round. I convinced the guy to give me a paper round, and then I worked where it says the Sun newspaper. That was pick a pack, the sweets, and I used to shout at all the kids for packing the sweets and stealing them, and I used to go, that's theft.
At the height of the PPE pandemic, Baroness Mone introduced her husband's consortium, PPE MedPro, to the government. As a result, they won a very substantial contract. Now, Baroness Mone finds herself subject to a criminal investigation. For the last 2 years, she has remained silent. She's been vilified in the press, there's been attacks on her, and as a result, her and her family have suffered. She says it's wrong. What's being said is inaccurate. It's untrue. She says she wants to correct it. She's agreed to talk to me. It won't be easy, and I won't make it easy for her. But let's hear what she has to say. Michelle, you had a poor and humble upbringing in the East End of Glasgow. Left school, age 15, no qualifications, but since then you've enjoyed huge success, a status of true rags to riches tale. Founded Ultimo and have an impressive entrepreneurial track record. You've become a recognised household name. 2015, appointed by the then Prime Minister to the Business Art and a Baroness in the House of Lords. But you're in a very different place today, currently under investigation, criminal investigation, with bank accounts frozen and headlines painting that you are a thief. You've profited from PPE pandemic. You've stepped away from all social media and you've not fought back. You've not said anything. This is your first interview. This is the first time you've spoken for almost 2 years. Why now?
Well, because we just can't take any more. We're sick and tired reading all the lies every single day in the media.
How difficult has it been to read some of the headlines?
So difficult, because, you know, I am outspoken, and I think everyone feels that because we have been silent that we are guilty. So the whole thing has been so scary that you just don't know what to do. And Doug and I look at one another and we think, no, today we are going to come out and we are going to respond, and we are going to respond to that message that they said, you know, put her in jail and orange jumpsuits, and we're going to throw acid over her and everything else. So there are times where we go, right, that's it. We're going to say something and we go, right, stop. Let's just think about it. Then we speak to the legal team and then they convince us not to do it. And it just kind of goes round in circles.
How bad do you feel at the moment?
On a scale of 10 being the worst, 12. And yeah, I am a very, very strong woman. I'm seeing a doctor and on medication and everything else, which I'm very against. But yeah, I needed it.
Sleeping?
No. No.
On your mind all the time?
Yeah, I probably sleep 1 hour and then I wake up maybe 2 hours. Panic attack, you know, like NCA coming crashing through your house. I think anyone would have a nightmare. And I see them over my bed and it's horrific. But it's been a real fight.
And the fight, are you going to win?
Yeah, we will win, because we've done nothing wrong. And it's cruel and it's nasty, but we will win. The evidence that we have got and what all the government, the Cabinet Office, everyone knew of my involvement.
You are now a Baroness in the House of Lords. Many would see that as part of the establishment. You are now in the House, you are the establishment. Is that how you see yourself?
No, I never have been part of the establishment. Love our country and everything else, but I've never been part of the establishment, and I never will be, nor do I want to be.
Now just tell me what the pandemic meant for you. You were at home on the Isle of Man. What are you thinking?
That I can fix it. I knew I could fix it.
Fix it as in?
Supply chain, getting quality, PPE, on time, at the best prices. I've been doing it for 25 years of my life. not PPE, 25 years of my life, but in manufacturing. And, you know, the reason I was put into the House of Lords was because I'm an expert in brand building, manufacturing.
You are under investigation by the NCA for a number of separate allegations. Firstly, conspiracy to defraud by entering into an agreement to defraud the DHSC. Did you attempt to defraud the DHSC?
Absolutely not. How can I defraud them when they knew I was involved? There's over 1,400 emails and communication on WhatsApps and phone calls. How can they say they didn't know I was involved? They knew everything.
They also say, and this is part of their investigation, they're investigating you for fraud by false representation. And it relates to dishonestly making false representation intending to make a gain for yourself by securing DHSC contracts for PPE MedPro.
I put their names forward. The guys got the contracts on their own merits. And no, it's not true. Again, another lie. They knew of my involvement. Everyone knew of my involvement.
How do you think people see Baroness Mone?
Right now, I think they probably see me as a horrible person, a liar, a cheat, a thief. I think they've just made up their mind, and on social media we have this kind of kangaroo court that everyone decides. And they've all made up their mind.
Do you think you got favourable treatment by the government, by the DHSC, because you are a baroness?
Absolutely not. And if it's that train of thought, then you should look at all the other MPs, baronesses, lords, senior civil servants that all put names forward that went into that VIP lane. They should all be the same as me right now. Why are they not?
How is it that the NCA are saying that you weren't upfront about your role?
It's 100% a lie. It's not true because of the sheer amount of communication, email, WhatsApp, phone calls. It's all there.
So when the NCA say that you were in a position where you benefited as a result of being a baroness, what would you say to that?
Well, I was a conduit. I was a liaison person. I brought, it all together. I wanted the guys to succeed. I wanted the NHS to succeed. I wanted a win-win situation for everyone. Both myself and my husband declared their interests. And if they had any issue with that whatsoever, when they knew of my involvement and my husband's involvement, why did they ever give the contracts in the first place? They must have been satisfied and they knew everything.
Does Michelle Mone struggle to step away from something? Does she like control over things? Is that what caused you to keep kind of being involved? You started something, so you got to finish it?
Once I commit to something, that's it. I've been criticised a lot in my career. I'm like a Jack Russell that never lets go. And that is me. That is who I am.
Is there an obsessiveness with Michelle Mone?
Yeah, probably. I'm a perfectionist. I can't deal with people who overpromise and underdeliver.
Matt Hancock wrote the Pandemic Diaries. He says that you were aggressive and threatening, throwing around wild accusations to try to help PPE MedPro win COVID contracts. Is that true?
No, that's not true at all. And in fact, it was many months after the event, after the guys had delivered the masks and had delivered the gowns, and I spoke to him about a completely different subject. I can sometimes come across feisty. It's just part of me, but I'm certainly not aggressive. I wasn't abusive, and I think he's got that completely wrong. And to be honest with you, I'm not a fan of his anyway.
During the course of your communication with the DHSC, the government, did you at any stage lie, tell any untruths?
Never. Absolutely. No, I didn't lie whatsoever. Why would I lie?
I've seen an article that says Lady Mone supported and helped PPE MedPro secure a place in the VIP lane.
I did not know about that VIP lane until I read about it in the newspapers myself. The guys didn't know about a VIP lane. What a lot of nonsense and lies again.
Michelle, you're coming over quite angry, quite aggressive. Why?
Well, I don't mean to be angry. I'm not, an angry person. But I'm really struggling at the moment. I'm uncomfortable doing this interview. It's been 2 years of not speaking about it. This is my first interview and I'm not doing well at the moment. My mental health and don't want people to feel sorry for me. I'm in a lot of pain and struggling. So I don't mean to come across angry, and if I have, I apologise.
You lied to the press, didn't you? Because you said you had no involvement in PPE MedPro. That's not true, is it?
I made an error in what I said to the press. I regret not saying to the press straight away, yes, I am involved. Yeah. And the government knew I was involved. And the emergency team, cabinet team knew I was involved. The government, DHSC knew that I was involved, the NHS, all of them knew I was involved. The legal team advised myself and my husband not to comment and not to say that of my involvement in PPE MedPro. What I did say to them was, I'm not a shareholder, which was true. I'm not a director, which was true. I am not financially benefiting directly, which is true. But I didn't want to start speaking to the press about it. And I didn't want the pain for my family again through the media, because it has been painful dealing with the media and I just didn't want it.
Michelle, have you benefited in any way from PPE MedPro money, either directly or indirectly?
Look, my husband's an entrepreneur. There was many entrepreneurs involved in PPE, supplying PPE, and the consortium that he led supplied huge volumes at very competitive prices that saved the NHS tens of millions of pounds. What my husband decides to do after the event and who benefits from that is at his discretion. I am his wife and I may indirectly benefit, but that's just like all other families around that are married. That's just it. That is not my money. I don't have that money. It's not my money.
What's the future for Baroness Michelle Mone?
The future is to get over all of this, to fight back, start fighting back now. And once it's all over, just, lead a very quiet, loving life and get, ourselves back to normal. And I don't ever think we will ever get back to normal. Everything, all the good that you've done your whole life is all trashed out the window. Maybe there is a reason why we've gone through it, so that we can maybe help others that have been in the same position as us, that don't have a voice, that are not heard.
In December 2020, the DHSC launched a civil claim against PPE MedPro after it claimed their gowns were not fit for use. And then, in May 2021, the National Crime Agency began investigating contracts awarded to PPE MedPro and the role of Baroness Mone and her husband Doug Barrowman in the awarding of those contracts. As part of this investigation, I have looked at both cases, and the civil claim, I believe, is destined to fail, with the DHSC having brought most of the problems on itself, with its contracts, storage and huge overspending. And in the criminal investigation, I suspect the NCA believe they have a strong case, because to date, on legal advice, Baroness Mone and Doug Barrowman have provided very limited responses to the NCA allegations. I believe if they answered the NCA's questions and provided all their evidence, then the NCA would have no case against them.
There is a uniqueness to this case. Doug Barrowman's consortium are the only company subject to litigation, and him and his wife, Baroness Mone, the only party subject to a criminal investigation. I believe both cases are joined up. But their case is very different to any other politician or person who referred into the high priority lane, because they're a married couple. Doug Barrowman is entitled to spend the money as he sees fit. So whatever he wants to give to his wife or his children from his earnings is up to him. And as a result, of course, they'll indirectly benefit from anything he earns. But it's now very different. They've given their account, their side to the story, which paints a very different narrative than being portrayed by the media and pushed by the government. It's clear the government's handling of the PPE pandemic was shambolic, at times utterly incompetent. But my investigation reveals a very serious allegation that a government official is alleged to have said for a sum of money he could make both the civil and the criminal case against Doug Barrowman and Baroness Mone go away. And that requires urgent investigation.
It was purely just whether there's a bigger pot, if you like, that is there to satisfy both elements.